All right, we are now live streaming on YouTube. My name's Evan Greer. I'm the director of Fight for the Future, and I'll be ushering us through this. We're letting folks in from the waiting room. Welcome everyone who's joining. Thanks for joining us. We are going to get through this quickly and give you some important thoughts from human rights, LGBTQ, and civil liberties experts about the dangerous and misguided Kids Online Safety Act, which is being voted out of the Senate as we speak. We'll give folks just about 2 more minutes to join in case folks are running late. And during that, I will give the repeated Zoom preamble, which is that reporters, etc., you will be on mute. But if you would like to ask a question when we get to Q&A, feel free to raise your hand and we can get you in, or feel free to type a question into the chat. I will be kind of ushering us through this and make sure that we hear from all of our great speakers. We have folks here from the Woodhull Freedom Foundation, from the ACLU, from TransOhio, and from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, who will be bringing different perspectives about why the Kids Online Safety Act would actually make kids less safe rather than more safe while undermining human rights and civil liberties for all. So we'll be talking about the piece of legislation, the concerns with it, and then what happens next in terms of how we are going to continue mobilizing a large grassroots coalition to oppose this in the House of Representatives, where I believe it will likely fail. And then I think the bigger question for us at Fight for the Future is what we do after that to actually take on the harms that big tech companies are doing without throwing marginalized communities and human rights under the bus. So we're now at 12:03, and I'm going to go ahead and just kick us right into it. Apologies if there's any repetition, but I know that some folks were trickling in. My name is Evan Greer. I use she, her, or they, them pronouns. I am the director of Fight for the Future, which is a nonprofit best known for helping organize some of the largest online protests in human history, defending people's basic rights in the digital age. I'm joined by Mandy Salley from the Woodhull Freedom Foundation, Jenna Leventoff from the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, Dara Adkison from TransOhio, and Joe Mullin from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, who will each be sharing their perspectives as civil liberties, LGBTQ rights, and human rights advocates, explaining why this bill is actually going to make young people and everyone less safe while undermining our ability to express ourselves online and actually failing to address the very real harm that is being done by big tech companies and their surveillance-driven business practices. So quickly, I will just start by sharing that myself, I am a parent, and I joined a letter with several hundred other parents of transgender and non-binary youth, basically begging the Senate to not do what they have done today, which is to advance the dangerous and misguided Kids Online Safety Act, a bill that purports to be about addressing the design flaws and privacy violations of big tech social media giants, but in fact, unfortunately, is effectively a blank check for censorship of any piece of content that an administration could claim is harmful to kids. KOSA creates a duty of care that covers the recommendation of content and gives the authority to the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, to enforce that. What that means in practice is that, for example, a Trump administration FTC would get to dictate what types of content platforms can recommend or even show to younger users. This bill has gone through a number of changes, but none of those changes address the fundamental flaws, which is why dozens of civil liberties, human rights, frontlines, LGBT groups, racial justice groups, and press freedom organizations continue to oppose it. So that's a quick overview of some of the concerns that have been raised. I'm going to hand it over now to Jenna Leventoff from the ACLU. Jenna, can you please speak to us about why the ACLU, which is, of course, the largest civil liberties organization in the United States, opposes this bill, and also particularly why the ACLU believes that this bill is very likely unconstitutional and wouldn't stand up in court?
Certainly. Thank you, everyone. And good afternoon, all. My name is Jenna Leventoff, and I am a senior policy counsel at the ACLU. So the First Amendment supports the fundamental belief that more information and not less is what allows marginalized voices to be heard. The First Amendment also ensures that the government isn't imposing their own beliefs upon us. The First Amendment doesn't just protect some of us, it guarantees everyone, including children, the right to access information free from censorship. As staunch defenders of the First Amendment, the ACLU cannot and will not tolerate censorship of protected information, online or off. Today, the Senate is going to vote to pass the Kids Online Safety Act. But the Kids Online Safety Act is nothing more than a thinly veiled effort to censor information that some consider objectionable for kids. But KOSA will not just lead to the censorship of content that many consider objectionable. It can also lead to the censorship of information that is important or even life-saving. If enacted, KOSA could lead to information about healthcare, gender identity, politics, and more being removed from social media. And kids know that such censorship will make them less and not more safe. As one student recently told me, they don't get sex education in school, and if information about sex is removed from the internet because platforms fear liability for hosting it, how else can they learn about safe sex? The ACLU recently had 300 students in town to talk to lawmakers about KOSA. Almost all of the students agree that they get their information online. The fact of the matter is, young people are naturally curious, and taking away potentially educational resources limits their learning and can actually endanger them. When information is censored because of KOSA, it's not just children who will suffer from an inability to access vital information, it's adults as well. To comply with KOSA, social media platforms and other websites might choose to censor or restrict certain types of content for all users, not just for minors. This could limit adults' ability to express themselves freely online or access diverse viewpoints. KOSA will also lead platforms to collect more data, as platforms are likely to require every adult to turn over their identification before accessing websites. When this happens, those without ID or without the digital skills to upload identification will be completely shut off from the internet. Those who can get on will find their privacy threatened by a platform who will know vital information about them. While we all want to keep kids safe online, KOSA is not the way to do it. We urge the House to vote against this dangerous bill. Congress needs to protect all young people's rights to express themselves online. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jenna. I really appreciate those comments. And I just want to underline what you led with, which is the constitutional concerns with this issue. While Fight for the Future, we're more of an advocacy organization. We don't do a lot of litigation, but we, again, are very concerned about the role that big tech companies are playing in our society. And we do think that there are legitimate concerns with their business practices. But what we can all agree on is that passing a bill that's very likely to just get immediately overturned in court isn't going to protect anyone, which is why lawmakers need to be listening to civil liberties experts like the ACLU before they advance a blatantly unconstitutional piece of legislation that's likely to fall apart under First Amendment scrutiny. We'll come back to the First Amendment, I'm sure, when we go to our friends at the EFF. But first, I want to go more to the front lines of this issue, because I think it's important that we recognize this isn't just being discussed in the halls of power in Washington, D.C., but we've actually seen such a large volume of particularly LGBTQ young people who have been speaking up about this issue online. Fight for the Future has compiled a gallery of videos and content created mostly by queer and trans young people at badinternetbills.com/testimonials, where we're actually lifting up the voices of teenagers and kids because there's unfortunately a lot of discussion in DC about how to protect them that tends to ignore what young people actually say would make them safer. Dara, I want to go to you, since you are working on the front lines in Ohio with trans people who have been in the crosshairs of extreme right-wing politicians across the country. How does the community that you're serving and working with view this piece of legislation, and how do they feel like it would affect them?
Yeah, I mean, KOSA is honestly truly terrifying, both in its current form and previous incarnations, and we've seen similar bills proposed at a state level. So the very visceral threat of content restriction and the kinds of resources that can deny to both youth and adults in Ohio and other parts of the country is very visceral and real. Like, it doesn't feel like hyperbole. I've literally had legislatures tell me to my face that they would love to see our website taken off the internet because they don't want people to have the kinds of vital community resources that we provide. Now, personally and as an organization, we believe strongly that the government should not be standing between youth and what kinds of content they can access, any more so than they should be standing between youth and their doctors and their healthcare decisions. Let people make those decisions individually, and have the government not intervene in them would be truly fantastic. There's so many other things that we need the government to help us with right now that is not restricting potentially vital resources from people. And it's honestly a really scary contingency that we're planning for, because I sincerely hope that everyone here is right and that if it does end up passing the Senate, it doesn't get out of Congress. But the possibility that we could be seeing a similar bill on the state level is something that TransOhio and many other orgs are prepared for, because we know there's people out there that would like us to not exist, and having the lack of visibility of the kinds of resources provided on the internet is a first step for that for many of these folks.
Thanks so much, Dara. Dara, just really quick to follow up on that. I think there's some misunderstanding of how KOSA works, and what supporters of the bill will often point to is that KOSA's duty of care requires companies to prevent the spread of content or stop themselves from recommending content that causes young people to experience a variety of specific mental health outcomes. And they are delineated in the bill as things like depression and anxiety. And so what supporters of the bill will say is like, well, no, that doesn't apply to LGBTQ content or trans content, for example, because that doesn't make kids depressed. From where you're sitting, and with what your community has experienced, why do you think that's wrong? And why do you think that the language of the bill as it stands actually would be used against the type of content that we're concerned about?
Well, so in Ohio right now, we just in the last couple of weeks had the trial in our common pleas court for a potential youth healthcare ban. And the state argued in defense of that bill that being trans itself would give you depression, which we all know is, false in many, many kinds of ways. But we literally see the state arguing that our mere existence is depressive and a mental disorder. And so when that's the argument at hand, it's not much of a leap to see those same people saying that resources for trans and gender nonconforming people would be categorized like that.
Yeah, thanks so much. And not only is it not a leap, but it's something that has actively been happening.
Yeah, it's
and we look at, for example, Project 2025, which explicitly names LGBTQ content, or even just talking about the existence of transgender people as quote unquote pornographic, and calls for the jailing of people that distribute that type of content to minors. And so, I'm a fan of the statement, when people tell you who they are, believe them. There is a movement in this country that has been very explicit about their intention to use legislation like KOSA to go after online resources for some of the most vulnerable young people in this country. And we should take them at their word and ensure that we're not passing legislation that basically greases the wheels or paves the way for Project 2025 style attacks on vulnerable communities. Speaking of these types of attacks, and speaking of what we already know, I think it's important to note that we don't actually have to kind of close our eyes and imagine what might happen if platforms were subjected to liability for recommending content to people, because we actually have a crystal clear example, which is SESTA FOSTA, a piece of legislation that was purported to address the horrific crime of online sex trafficking, but which in fact actually led to widespread harm to consensual sex workers and others. And Mandy, I know your organization, the Woodhull Freedom Foundation, has done a tremendous amount of work on that issue and has been leading one of the main lawsuits against SESTA FOSTA. Can you tell us what we can learn from SESTA FOSTA and why KOSA actually repeats the same misguided thinking that was behind it, and what we can expect if this legislation were to pass through the House?
Yeah, absolutely. So FOSTA, Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, does something very similar to the Kids Online Safety Act in that it's marketed incredibly well, right? It's all in the name. It says it wants to stop sex trafficking online, while in actually not doing that at all. So FOSTA was passed in 2018. So we have a good amount of years here to see exactly whether it impacted sex trafficking at all. And it didn't improve. It didn't improve by I mean reduce sex trafficking that happens online. What it actually did is made the lives of sex workers much more difficult. So Woodhull actually just published a study not too long ago, a couple of months ago, on the effect of deplatforming on sex workers. And what we found is 78% of sex workers have reported being deplatformed, meaning losing access to some sort of online platform. That could be an Instagram account, it could be PayPal. They are impacted and their income is directly impacted by the passage of Sesta Fosta in 2018. We also know that folks who are not sex workers have been impacted by the chilling effect that Fosta caused. We've seen sex educators, we've seen LGBTQ content creators, folks talking about abortion, reproductive health, lose access to their social media accounts or have their content be shadow banned or downranked. In fact, the Woodhull Freedom Foundation Instagram account is currently shadow banned. We're not doing anything explicit or pornographic on our Instagram page, but our content has been deemed, harmful or violating community standards. So we've already seen that kind of impact, that kind of censorship happening, that over moderation on social media. And I think we're just going to see more of it should KOSA pass the House and become law. And I'm really particularly concerned about the impact on youth in states that are already living under abortion bans or living in the 25 states that have bans on gender affirming care. I think you're just going to see that kind of censorship get much worse.
Thanks so much, Mandy. And I think it is important to underline that while Sesta Fosta led to widespread over-removal of content related to sex and sexuality, the way that KOSA is written, it is so wildly broad, it could be used to remove more or less any piece of content, or rather suppress any piece of content that, again, a federal trade commission would be willing to claim causes anxiety and depression among youth. Marsha Blackburn, who's one of the lead sponsors of KOSA, has been explicit, again, in her intention to use it to go after transgender content. But she's also on the record as saying that learning about our nation's history of slavery is harmful to kids. We've seen folks on the right argue that learning about climate change makes kids depressed. And so KOSA is like Sesta Fosta, but with a much broader mandate and could lead to widespread suppression of all kinds of important topics that young people need to be discussing. Joe, I know that the Electronic Frontier Foundation has done a lot of work on the constitutional issues here. I know you also did a survey of young people where they had an opportunity to speak up and share what their concerns are with this type of legislation. Walk us through what EFF's concerns with this bill are, and also what you've heard from the young people that you reached out to ask what they think.
Yeah, thanks, Evan. Thanks for mentioning that survey. We heard from, I think a couple thousand people when we reached out on Discord to ask young people what they would think about this bill. And what we heard was overwhelming. It was the same value system that most adults in the US agree with, which is that in this country, we don't want politicians, attorneys general, or the FTC making the rules about what we can read and watch online. That's a terrible mistake. It does violate the First Amendment, but I think the politicians that are behind this bill will find out it's also just not a value system that most Americans agree with. Americans overwhelmingly want to be able to read what they want, watch what they want, and that includes young people. That's who we heard from in this survey. I think the politicians who are some of them may be hoping that if there's a permanent system of who can game the refs of the online world, they will come out on top. But I think that's a really bad bet. We live in a huge and diverse country. People do not know who the next administration is going to be. They don't know who's going to run the FTC. And the way we talk about all the issues that have been mentioned here are very different from place to place. I also don't think it's a really good bet if you're a conservative. The way people talk about guns or other issues like that are not the same in California as in Tennessee, as in New York. So some of these things are not going to benefit from state intervention. Like Evan, I'm a parent too. I have a 4-year-old. Of course, I moderate the content of what he sees, not just on electronic devices, but I get a paper New York Times in the mail. I control which pictures he sees and not, because it's not all appropriate. There's no situation in which state intervention is going to make those kinds of individual and family decisions better. It's going to make it a lot worse. And I think some of this is just based on hoping or believing that the enforcement of a speech law will be done by the good guys. And we've just never seen that be the case. And that's why it's better to stick by our First Amendment values. The specifics that are in this law, where you can break the rules if you have content that depresses kids, that causes anxiety in kids, that's about leads to drug or alcohol abuse. The fact is, Americans just don't agree about which conversations are beneficial and which conversations are harmful. The second fact is, neither the software filters that will be used nor actual humans are really that good at differentiating between a conversation that's promoting drug use or alcohol use and a conversation where people are concerned about drug and alcohol use that they see around them and in their community. And the same thing is true for the other ills that are listed out in this bill. So we're going to see a more censored internet if this comes to pass. Content moderation at scale is impossible to do in a way that makes everyone happy. There are things that could make our online experience better and safer. Comprehensive privacy law, more competition, a wider array of platforms and voices so that the internet isn't just 5 big platforms facing each other. That's stuff we can work on. KOSA doesn't have it. None of that stuff is in KOSA. KOSA is about making sure the wrong content in the view of the politicians in control gets offline. And that's going to be a losing bet for all of us if it passes.
Thanks so much, Joe. And I think that last point is really important to highlight. I don't think anyone on this call or in this large coalition of organizations that oppose KOSA are saying that, big tech is fine and we should just leave them alone and let them do whatever they want. Everyone here has called for example, strong privacy legislation, which would crack down on the ability of these companies to effectively spy on our kids and use the information that they collect to recommend them content. A lot of the problems that supporters of KOSA say that they're trying to address are legitimate concerns. I am also concerned about the way that large tech social media companies monitor the behaviors of users on their platform and then use that data to recommend content. We have seen that can lead to the over-amplification of harmful content, but that's something that you can solve through privacy legislation by cutting off their ability to conduct that commercial surveillance in the first place. That's a manner of addressing that same concern to stop that rabbit hole where maybe someone watches a video about dieting and then gets recommended a video about eating disorders. But without violating the First Amendment or putting the government in charge of what content platforms can show to which users, which will always be a blank check for abuse and censorship, really regardless of who is in power. And so I just want to underline that Fight for the Future are strong supporters of privacy, antitrust, and algorithmic justice legislation. We think there's a lot that Congress should be doing to meaningfully address the harm of big tech companies. And frankly, I think KOSA lets them off the hook. It actually empowers the largest tech companies to maintain their dominance. It gives them more control over what we see and do online. And it staves off more meaningful regulation that would actually hold up in court, that might actually address the fundamental underlying business model that is at the root of these companies' harm. So not only is KOSA not going to protect kids, KOSA actually is helping big tech, which perhaps is why some very large big tech companies like Microsoft, X, and Snap support it. And so I think we should be very concerned about that as we head into the House. And I'll also note that we are not alone as opponents of this bill on this call. As I mentioned, if you go to stopkosa.com, you can see dozens of other civil liberties, human rights, LGBTQ, and racial justice organizations that also oppose this bill. There are folks from across the political spectrum opposing this. And we've also seen Senator Wyden in the Senate, who sent us this statement in support of this press conference, which I'm going to read now, and then we'll open things up for questions after I just briefly mention what's happening in the House, and we'll get a few more quick thoughts from everyone before we wrap, hopefully on the half hour. So quickly from Senator Ron Wyden, a Democrat from Oregon, he says, everyone agrees tech companies need to be held accountable, and Congress needs to do more to keep kids safe online. But that shouldn't mean making some kids safer while putting others in harm's way. I appreciate the intent of KOSA and support restrictions on harmful design elements, along with new privacy protections for teenagers. At the same time, I implore my colleagues in the House to listen to the LGBTQ teens and the folks on the call today. It's not too late to do more to ensure that KOSA can't be misused by MAGA politicians who are waging a dangerous and retrograde culture war. It's not too late to make common sense changes to KOSA to ensure it can't be used to scare platforms away from responsible use of privacy protecting technologies like encryption or anonymous accounts. I hope Congress can work together to pass legislation to make all kids safer. So that is from Senator Ron Wyden. Thank you, Senator Wyden, for sending that in. And I'll just echo that last point. We all want a world where kids are safer, but I also want a world where kids have basic human rights and have tools that they can use to express themselves. When we look around, we see young people using social media right now to speak out about the issues that are impacting them, whether that's substance abuse in their community, gun violence in their schools, the ongoing climate crisis, or what's happening in Palestine. We need legislation that addresses the harm of big tech and still lets young people fight for the type of world that they actually want to grow up in. So with that, I will open it up for questions. If you're a reporter on the call, feel free to drop a question in the chat or raise your hand and we can unmute you to ask your question. I know folks are probably trying to write their stories and get out of here quick. So if there aren't any questions, I'll also just open it back up to our panel to quickly go over any final points. So we have Rick Weber asking, who are your advocates in the House to block KOSA and what legislative alternatives are there? I will quickly just shout out that we saw Axios reporting that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, is opposed to KOSA. Representative Maxwell Frost, who's actually the youngest member of the House of Representatives, was the first House member to come out against KOSA. And we have heard that there are significant concerns from others in leadership, including Representative Pallone. Does anyone else want to speak to how things are in the House, and also to what legislative alternatives to KOSA there are? We've obviously mentioned privacy and antitrust legislation, but does anyone else want to speak to that question? Or did I cover it? Yeah, I'll quickly just say that Fight for the Future would support, for example, a heavily modified version of KOSA that specifically delineates the types of business practices that we're trying to regulate. So, for example, something that goes after practices like autoplay and infinite scroll and gives the FTC the authority to declare them unfair and deceptive business practices, while also banning things like targeted advertising to kids. There is a lot that can be done that does not involve a broad duty of care that covers speech and thus raises these free expression and human rights concerns from our perspective. Maya Levine is in the chat asking, does the coalition have any feedback on COPPA 2.0? I'll quickly say that this coalition here has come together largely around KOSA. Fight for the Future is neutral on COPPA 2.0. We believe it does some good things and would help crack down on some of the abusive surveillance practices of companies. But we also believe that privacy legislation should protect everyone, and that the best way to protect young people is by actually advancing comprehensive privacy legislation rather than narrowly focused legislation just because it's politically expedient to make it about kids. But I'll quickly open it up to the panel if anyone else wants to speak to COPPA 2.0, while noting that this coalition is united around KOSA and there may be differing views on COPPA.
I'm not the best person to speak about privacy stuff at EFF, but if someone wants to follow up on EFF specifically, I could put them in touch with the right person for a privacy bill.
What I will say also is that if COPPA 2.0 remains bundled with KOSA, it's likely to fail because KOSA is a deeply controversial bill that raises these significant free expression and human rights concerns and has faced widespread opposition from particularly LGBTQ young people online. So for folks that are interested in advancing COPPA, I would strongly recommend that they try to separate it from this dangerous censorship bill. Censorship and privacy do not go together, and these should not be moving together.
Yeah, instead of saying nothing, I want to second what Evan said. Privacy legislation can and should be done without trying to break the First Amendment. We have ideas about how to do that. And one of them is along the lines of what Evan said, targeted ads could just be banned. I mean, we could have a conversation about that. That would be a difficult and challenging conversation, but we'd love to have it. Instead, we're hearing about, what's the bad content and who are the cops that are going to wipe it off the internet. That's not the right direction.
Great. Do we have any final questions or any final thoughts from our panel or important items that folks want to make sure are not missed? We will send out a recording of this after the event, as well as quotes from the organizations that are here. Folks here are available for interviews or follow-up questions. If folks want to reach out, we'll make sure that reporters have everyone's contact information. Going once, going twice. Thank you everyone so much for joining. Again, my name's Evan Greer. I'm the director of Fight for the Future. We're going to keep fighting this, and I want to give a shout out to the youth, to the young people. This bill has gone through a lot of changes. Some of those changes do reduce the chances that it will do the type of harm that we're concerned about, and all of the credit for that goes to the LGBTQ youth and others that have been speaking out about this. So, not for the reporters, but for everyone else, please don't take your eye off the ball. Please do keep speaking up. We have a tremendous chance to either stop this bill or get it completely fixed in the House. And we need to keep working to fight for a future where we have the ability to express ourselves online, where kids are safe, but also where their basic rights and their dignity and humanity is protected. So that's what we're fighting for. And thanks so much to